guests. I have the honor of introducing our main speaker tonight, Morgan Wienberg. Morgan hails from Whitehorse in the Yukon, and she graduated from high school in 2010. At that time, she had plans to study medicine at McGill University, but the earthquake hit in Haiti, and she signed up as a volunteer to teach English and to help, in a prosthetics lab. She also attended, or rather she volunteered at an orphanage in Haiti, and that is the subject of, at least it's part of her talk tonight, so we're looking forward to hearing that. She returned after that volunteer stay, she returned to Canada, and she found that she had trouble sleeping, remembering about the kids that she slept on the floor with in Haiti. They had no beds. She took 3 jobs to save up to return to Haiti, and she had saved up money to attend McGill University, but with that money, she and a friend founded a foundation called Little Footprints, Big Steps, which offers safe places for children to receive care in Haiti while their parents are traced. This article was written 2 years ago, so things have changed, but 2 years ago, her foundation had helped rescue 86 children, and they were educating 156 children at that time. One of the children I'm looking forward to hearing about is just amazing. She became his legal guardian to bring him to Miami for surgery. Morgan has quite a lot of friends throughout the continent now. One of these friends is Sarah Wilson, the co-founder of Little Footprints, Big Steps? Thank you. Morgan, according to Sarah Wilson, doesn't have any interest in material things. She is probably the most incredible person I've ever met. It seems a lot of people think that because tomorrow morning, Morgan will meet with the Governor General of Canada to receive the Meritorious Service Cross Medal. She has received the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal. She has received an academic awards from the Governor General of Canada already. She received the Yukon Commissioner Award. She was recognized in Washington, D.C. as a finalist for the Burger Marx Foundation for Young Women Impacting Social Justice. And you'll be glad to hear she was awarded the Rotary International Paul Harris Fellowship Award for Humanitarian Impact at the age of 19. She was a keynote speaker at the 2013 United Nations Youth Assembly. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Morgan Wienberg.
Thank you so much for coming to listen to me tonight. It's always really special for me to connect with Rotary clubs. My hometown of Whitehorse, Yukon, the Rotary clubs there have been really consistent supporters of me since 2011. And even on the ground in Haiti, there are some Rotarians, actually the district governor, who have been incredibly supportive as well. So it's really a pleasure for me to come here tonight. I do have a slideshow to play. Okay, good, it's working. So, most of you are probably aware that in 2010, a devastating earthquake hit Haiti. And even before this earthquake, Haiti was the most impoverished country in the Western Hemisphere. So you can imagine if a country is already that impoverished and an earthquake hits, how devastating this was. And at the time, I was 18 years old. I was at my mom's house in Whitehorse, Yukon, and just about to graduate from high school. But when I saw the suffering of the Haitian people featured so prominently in the media, I was really compelled to go there and help in any way I could to actually connect with these people. So 2 weeks after graduation, in June 2010, I went to Haiti for the first time. Now, I was thinking I would go and volunteer for a few months and then return to Canada for university. But to this day, I still live in Haiti. So what happened? Well, my first week in Haiti, I was introduced to a locally run orphanage. And this orphanage was home to about 75 children. But these children were just living in the worst conditions of any human being I'd ever seen. And I'd seen other orphanages, I'd visited tent villages where all of the people living in tents were amputees. But I had not seen any human living in the conditions of these kids. Now, there were 75 children. There were no adults looking after them. 7 and 8-year-olds would be looking after toddlers. 13 and 14-year-old girls would stay home from school to do the cooking and cleaning. And you could walk into the orphanage and see a 2-year-old lying in his own vomit on the floor. And people would walk by. Nothing would be done about it. These children would be crying of thirst every time I visited. And they were fed only one meal per day of plain white rice, not even cooked with salt or oil. Now, as they dished out this one meal per day of white rice, sometimes there wasn't enough to go around. So the boys were always fed last. And sometimes they wouldn't get that meal. And I remember one time there was a 12-year-old boy named Judelin, and I'd watched. He'd gone 3 days in a row without being fed. So I went out and bought a stick of salami to give to this boy. But when the adults running the orphanage saw that I'd given him food, he was beaten with a metal belt buckle until he had open wounds on his arm. And then he was too afraid to be seen talking to me and too afraid to even be seen near the kitchen area. So he went and hid under a bush in the corner of the orphanage yard until he was able to go back in the kitchen because he was too weak to stand up, but too afraid to go anywhere near the food. And that's what it was like for all of these kids when they were sick. If they were seen laying down, they would be beaten and told that they're lying to get out of doing work. So they would have to hide if they were sick. But even more frightening than this abuse was that the kids really had no identity. They weren't even called by their name. It was little boy or little girl, and most of them didn't know their birth dates. But what terrified me was that if one of these kids disappeared or died, no one would even notice. Nothing would be done about it. And I realized that my plans for university and my own life could wait, but these kids really couldn't wait. So I did go back to Canada at that point, but instead of going to university, I worked and saved up with the goal of helping these kids. And in the beginning of 2011, actually on the day of my 19th birthday, I returned to Haiti. But this time I went independently, and I showed up at that orphanage and asked if I could live there alongside the kids. I thought if I was there 24/7, I would be able to have a bigger impact in these kids' lives. So for the next 5.5 months, I lived in this orphanage as the only foreigner with those 75 children. So I learned to speak Creole pretty quickly. And we were sleeping in a military tent, so it was a big open tent with nothing on the ground. And each night they would roll out a plastic tarp on the rocks, which is where the 40 youngest kids and I would sleep. So you would see rats and cockroaches crawling over your feet in the night. If one child had diarrhea, the others would wake up with it caked onto their faces. If it rained, everyone would have to squish into the middle of the tent so as not to get wet. If it was a windy night, you would wake up with, dust in your teeth. But that was just for the 40 youngest children. Because if a child was 10 or 11 years or older in this orphanage, they weren't even allowed inside the tent. They just had to sleep outside. So the 15 oldest boys shared a picnic table, and they would put pieces of cardboard underneath, and that's where they would sleep. And if I tried to give those boys warm clothes or blankets, they would be taken away. Anything these kids had would be taken away and sold for the orphanage owner's profit. There were actually 5 or 6 different international organizations supporting this orphanage, but all of the money and food and items that they donated was sold. It wasn't given to the kids. This was a for-profit orphanage. And even the children were being sold. Because as a 19-year-old, I was offered 5 kids for $800 each. And what I learned as I began to understand the local language, and even as I began to speak Creole, the older kids couldn't be seen speaking to me openly because they would be beaten and punished. So it was when I would shower, which would be with a bucket on some rocks, the older girls would all come to help me shower. So one of them would carry the bucket of water, the others would hold up a towel for me, others would hold my clothes. But in reality, that was our time to talk. And they would be explaining to me what kind of abuse they'd been through that day, why they families who were alive and who loved them, who they missed. So why were they in this corrupt orphanage? Well, the orphanage owner would actually approach some of the most vulnerable communities in rural areas of Haiti, and she would even go into their churches, claiming that she has this orphanage with foreign support, that she can send children to school and to university, that she can feed them. And the parents in these communities are so desperate, and they're seeing a lot of aid come into Haiti that's being funneled into institutions. So the mentality of these parents is that if my child is with me on the countryside, there's no way I'm going to be able to send him to school. But maybe if he's in an orphanage, he'll get some of that support. So these parents choose the child that they think has the most potential, and they give him or her up to the orphanage. But in reality, once the child is in the orphanage, it's a completely different situation. So here I was, I'd been fundraising and using my university savings, to try and change the living conditions of these kids. And what I realized was that if I want to help these kids, that doesn't mean they have to be in an orphanage for me to do that. So I asked the kids, if I promised to send you to school, anywhere you were, where would you want to be? And every single one of them said, I would want to live with my family. So it was really as simple as lending my phone to the kids, and some of them knew their parents' phone numbers. And they would call and say, Mom, I'm being really badly abused. I have someone willing to send me to school. Can you come and get me? And parents started to come and reclaim their kids from the orphanage. And I would pretend I didn't know what was going on. But then I would go and meet up with them at their homes to register those kids for school, get them to the hospital, and whatever other support I could get them. So I was able to reunite about 15 kids while actually living in that orphanage. And this was right around the time that I co-founded Little Footprints, Big Steps, with the goal of being able to support these kids once they were reunited with their families. And I also started advocating to shut down this orphanage because of the abuse and trafficking that was going on. So that kind of caused things to get a bit tense, and I did end up moving out of the orphanage. And I moved actually to a community in southern Haiti, which is statistically where most of these kids who are in corrupt orphanages or in slavery are being taken from. They're leaving the countryside in southern Haiti and coming into the big cities. So with most of these kids' families being in the south, that's where I moved to. And once I moved to the south, which is still where I live and where I call home, in a community called Langley, I came across another problem. Because every day I would walk down the street, and at one street corner there was a big roundabout. And every day when I passed that roundabout, I would see 35 to 40 children sleeping there in the streets. Children sometimes 7 or 8 years old. And not only did these kids have nowhere to go when it rained, when there was an earthquake, they only had the clothes on their backs, but these kids actually didn't even see themselves as humans like the rest of society. So I could walk up and find this little boy who hadn't eaten that day and offer to take him to a restaurant, but he would feel too ashamed to go in a restaurant or go in a grocery store because of his dirty clothes or the fact that he lives in the streets. And so what I started to do was just sit down and talk with them every day. I would just sit down beside these kids on the side of the road and get to know them as people and try to show them that I'm equal with them. And as I did that every day, these kids began to trust me. And instead of begging, they would actually share with me why they'd come to the streets. And what I found out was that it was almost the same reason those kids were in the corrupt orphanage. These street children had families. Their families were just too poor to look after them. So they couldn't send their kids to school. There's no food at home. And these children actually eat more by begging in the streets than by sitting at home. But as soon as I offered to send them to school, 10 of those kids went home, just for the opportunity to go to school. And I started doing the same thing with the street kids that I've been doing with the kids in the orphanage, reuniting them with their families, and then following up to make sure they have the chance for education and medical care, and actually trying to address the root cause. So if these kids are separated from their families because of poverty, how do we change that? In the beginning, I would actually support some of the families every month with food. But what I realized was that that's actually undermining the authority of the parents. So now we try and focus on making each family more sustainable, which for some parents it means providing livestock or gardening tools, depending on where they live. For other parents it means business startup. And this became the main program of Little Footprints, Big Steps, reuniting kids with their families and then following up to try and make each family more self-sustainable. And we've actually reunited over 120 kids at this point, 52 of which were from the corrupt orphanage, and then the rest who were from the streets. But what I realized was that we weren't always able to reunite the kids immediately. Sometimes it takes time to trace their families. Sometimes these kids are physically and emotionally so ill that they need time to heal before they can safely be reunited with their families. So I created a transitional safe house. Now I didn't want to create an orphanage which would perpetuate the problem of abandonment, but we needed a place where these kids could safely be rescued to and then eventually reunited with their families. So we currently operate a transitional safe house for boys and one for girls. And this is, again, a place where those kids can be rescued to immediately, but get the care that they need to start to heal emotionally and physically until we're able to reunite them with their families. A lot of the street children especially need a bit more structure before behaviorally they're able to, reunite with their parents. So this is the second main program of Little Footprints, Big Steps, is the transitional safe houses. And in this way, the goal of the safe houses is really to increase the capacity of the local authorities as well. Because orphanages are often being filled up. You know, each child that you place, that's another place that's filled. But with transitional housing, these kids are eventually reunited, and that space is available to rescue more kids. So we've become, developed a very close relationship with the local authorities as well. Which brings me to our third main program, being continued advocacy. And a lot of the time when parents would go to reclaim their children from this orphanage, the parents would actually be beaten and told that they can't claim their children. There was one mother who went to reclaim her 3-year-old daughter, Julie, and the mother was kicked in the head, and she had to return 3 times before she was successfully able to take her daughter home. There are other parents who are able to reclaim their children, but are told if you want your child's birth certificate, you have to pay for it. And children need the birth certificate even to register for school in Haiti. There are other parents who went to reclaim their children and found that their children were not there. So they'd either died or been trafficked. And in those cases, we accompany the parents to take this to court and try and trace their children. And we also were heavily involved in closing down that orphanage. In addition, under our advocacy program, unfortunately, I've had to accompany quite a few children in our outreach program who were victims of sexual assault, even a 4-year-old child, a 4-year-old little girl. And in accompanying these victims, to the hospital and to the police station, I began discussing with other child protection actors in the area, and we realized this was a huge problem, sexual assault against children, which were just staggering cases in the area. And we wanted to do something on a larger level, aside of just helping the victims, actually focus on prevention. So my organization is part of a network of child protection actors called the Working Group for Child Protection. And within that group, you have different departments of the local government, including social services, the Ministry for Women's Rights, Ministry for Handicapped People's Rights, as well as the Child Protection Brigade of the police, and a few other NGOs. So together with those organizations, we've started an initiative of doing community trainings, where we'll go into local schools, churches, and work with a group of community leaders in vulnerable areas to train them in prevention of violence and specifically prevention of sexual assault. And some of the youth that were actually previously in this corrupt orphanage are now becoming leaders, participating in those trainings in other communities, which is probably the most exciting thing for me to see. But I did want to actually share with you the story of one child in particular, who you can see actually in these photos, one boy who has a tumor in his cheek. And I'm just going to bring up another slideshow that's only photos of him. This boy's name is Isaac. And as was mentioned, I'm his legal guardian. So here I am. I just turned 24 and I have a 16-year-old. But I met Isaac when he was 12 years old, and he was one of the children who was sleeping on that roundabout in the street corner. Now, even though I met Isaac when he was 12 years old, he'd been living in the streets since he was 9. So here was this 9-year-old little child who was alone in the streets while he was grieving his mother's death. During the earthquake, he was alone in the streets, made more money than the other kids by begging, but that made him a target. So his shoes would be stolen right off of his feet while he was sleeping. His pants would be slit with knives and the money stolen from his pockets while he was sleeping. He would even be lit on fire and burned. His eyes would be crazy glued shut by the other kids. And as a result, Isaac became incredibly aggressive and violent as a means of survival. Now, he fed himself by taking a wire clothes hanger, bending it into a spear, and going fishing at the beach. And that's how he survived. Now, when I met Isaac, he actually wouldn't even speak with you. And each day when I would sit with the other street kids and talk to them, he would be around, but the other kids would say, "You don't need to bother talking to him, he's crazy." And that's really how the whole community saw him. Here's this little kid who's been living in the streets barefoot for 3 years, and everyone just considered him crazy. If you spoke to him, he wouldn't respond with words. He would make animal noises or do a crazy laugh and look at you with wide eyes and then run off. And he would never let you get closer, than an arm's length away. And Isaac, I think of all the kids that I've worked with, and we're sending about 250 kids to school now, he's the child who was the slowest to trust. And when you think about it, every single person he trusted in left or abandoned him. But as I was working with these street kids and, sitting and talking to them every day, eventually they trusted me enough to come and live in the safe house. But not Isaac. He might come and cook up his fish in the safe house, but then he'd go back to the streets to sleep, because that's what he knew. And I remember, walking home, and I would see him crouching on the side of the street, starting to fall asleep. And I offered him a blanket one day, and he shook his head and he said, "They'll take it." So he couldn't have any possessions because they'd be taken away from him. Now, eventually Isaac was the only kid left at that street corner, but I still would go and sit with him every day. But I did start to get discouraged. Here I was every day sitting beside this boy, and I would talk to him, but he would never respond. Sometimes he would actually look the other way to pretend that he couldn't hear me. But I knew he could hear me, so I just kept talking. Sometimes I didn't even say anything, I just sat beside him. But I did start to think, maybe I'm wasting my time. I don't think I'm really making any difference for him. I didn't see any progress. And then one day I was late going to visit Isaac. So maybe I usually spoke to him at about 2 in the afternoon, and that day I didn't make it there until the nighttime. So I found Isaac at this roundabout in the street, and he was crying. And he said, "I thought you weren't going to come." And that's when I realized that it did make a difference for him. Just the fact that I was going to visit him every day was the most consistency he'd had in years. And if I didn't talk to him, no one would that day. He wouldn't have any human interaction. So eventually, Isaac did trust me enough to come and live in the safe house. Now, he'd never been to school for a day in his life. He didn't know how to write his name. But we put him in school and had him tutored in the afternoons. And now, Isaac just turned 16. He's at a 4th grade level, but he's actually in English immersion school this year and is the top of his class. He just got 95%, and he was singled out for the best behavior, the most self-disciplined. So he's really thriving. And each Saturday, Isaac goes to do an apprenticeship in a mechanic shop. But in 2013, I actually took Isaac to Miami for surgery. So he had his tumor removed. We spent 5 months in Miami. And then the following year, we returned to Miami for another 6 months where he had reconstructive surgery. And later this year, he is supposed to have a 3rd surgery. So here's this child who everyone in the community just kind of wrote off as a crazy street person. And now, not only is he thriving, but he's actually had more opportunity and experience than most adults in his community. And when I think about Isaac's story, there are really 2 main lessons that I take out of it. Which is, first of all, you really can't judge anyone's potential by looking at where they are now. You never know, if they're in a different position or given a different opportunity, all that they can become. And helping these people is really about inspiring them to see their own potential. And second of all, we tend to underestimate the power that each of us has to impact other people and to make a difference. So often we think that, maybe I'm not a doctor, or I'm not old enough, or I'm too old, or I'm not wealthy enough. But really, all it takes is the ability to notice those around you and connect with them. There's so much potential in that. So instead of asking ourselves, am I able to make a difference? It's really, how am I going to make a difference? And that's all I have. I don't know if there are any questions or if we have time. Yeah?
Did they close down the orphanage?
They did eventually close down that orphanage. Now, I went to the authorities with photo evidence, with video footage that I'd secretly taken. I had parents whose children died in the orphanage testifying. We had arrest warrants based on murder and trafficking charges for the orphanage owner, but it still actually took 3 years to shut down that orphanage. And the reason for that is this orphanage was one on a list of 600 corrupt orphanages that the authorities needed to shut down. And those are only the ones that the authorities are aware of. So I know there are more than that, which are exploiting kids. So here, the authorities don't really have the capacity to move very quickly with that. And especially when we were trying to shut down this particular orphanage, the question was, okay, yes, we've investigated this, we know this orphanage needs to be shut down immediately. Where do we move the kids to? And so that's really where I got the concept of the transitional housing, which is now there's the answer that we have somewhere we can move these kids to immediately, and then they'll be transitioned out so the space is available. At the time that the orphanage was shut down, 3 years later, a child had died in 2012. I had actually been able to reunite about 52 of those 75 kids with their families. So there shouldn't have been many kids left, but with each child that I reunited, the orphanage owner would go out and recruit more kids. So at the time that they shut it down, there were actually 120 children in that orphanage. And together with authorities, we were able to reunite most of those kids with their families, except for about 10 children who were babies, and we had no way to trace their families. So they were placed in registered orphanages that the government holds to a certain standard. And actually this year, because we work quite closely with the local social services, their priority is working on shutting down those orphanages. So of those 600, corrupt and abusive orphanages, they've identified the 200 which are worse, the worst orphanages, and there's about 5,000 kids in those 200 orphanages. So now the big dilemma that the authorities have is, where do we move these 5,000 kids to while we trace their families? And I have a meeting actually about that the week after I get back to Haiti with them. So it's a huge issue, and it's something I think addressing the issue of these corrupt orphanages, it requires education in Haiti with the parents to prevent them from giving up their kids, but it also takes education in the global community, because like I said, 5 or 6 different organizations were actually supporting this orphanage and perpetuating the problem. Whereas if they'd approached the local authorities to know which orphanages are registered, we would have avoided that whole situation. So, yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah. Brandon?
I know that you've reached out to others to help in this endeavor, and I'm pretty sure you have got an amazing mom.
I really do have an amazing mom. She's right here.
Could you tell us a little bit about the others that are involved, and there's a co-founder?
Yes, Sarah Wilson is the co-founder. She's a paramedic in Kitchener, Ontario. So I actually met Sarah during my very first trip to Haiti in 2010. at which point, like as was mentioned, I was volunteering, doing English classes and a couple different things. So Sarah was down there at the same time as me as a paramedic, and so she went to this orphanage right as I was, first being introduced to it. And then she returned to Canada, I returned back to Haiti. And she was, I guess, following on Facebook, on social media, when I started reuniting the kids with their families. So I got this email from Sarah, and I only made it online about once a week, if that. So I got this email saying, I've been following the work that you're doing. Do you want me to, do all the logistics to found an organization to support what you're doing? So I said yes, and as I was on the ground, kind of developing our outreach program, she did all the logistics here in Canada to formally create an organization. And my mom is on the board of directors. She's probably the most involved director, and it's been a huge, obviously to the level that we've expanded now, which is where, I have 11 Haitian employees who are managing things now as I'm here. And we have the 2 safe houses, as well as 250 kids that we're sending to school every year. We really wouldn't have been able to expand to that. So I'm really lucky to have my mom so heavily involved doing fundraising events. And most of our funding is still coming from individual donors. So my mom is doing a lot of the communications, thanking every single person who donates, and fundraising. But we also have, like as I mentioned, some Rotary clubs involved in Whitby, Ontario, and also in Whitehorse, who are working on writing up some matching grant proposals for us. Because I mentioned the safe houses, but we've actually been renting those facilities for the last 5 years. So this year, our big goal is to actually purchase land, which will also make a really strong statement in the community that we're here to have a long-term impact. We're not just coming and leaving as many NGOs did. So our goal is to purchase land and actually construct our permanent safe house structures. And among those structures, to have a community training center. So this is something that the Rotary clubs are interested in helping with once they connect with the Rotary Club in Haiti.
Any more questions? Yeah, Bob, and then the lady.
You're messing with a lot of people's money. Have you been threatened? Your life threatened? Anything like that?
A few times. Yeah, my staff and I have been threatened by, in the beginning we were threatened by this, this particular woman who was running the orphanage. And now the community has really become so protective of us, which in the beginning we weren't sure about. We had to kind of go undercover into certain communities when we were visiting the kids, and now there are whole communities where they're afraid of the word orphanage, and there's no way they would give up their kid. And I've become very well known in the community that we work in as well. So I have been threatened a few times. But for every person who, seems to want to do something negative, there's like 25 people around who maybe don't even know you, but are super protective. So I found a lot of comfort in just the way that I'm received by the community.
Yeah, over here.
Just wondering, as far as what we consider professionals like social workers or mental health and that, do you have people helping or volunteering, or are Haitians stepping up and doing that?
A little bit of both. I have had some long-term volunteers come down, but at the same time there have been times where we really try to focus on locals helping the community and building it up that way. So most of the time I'm the only foreigner on the ground, although we have even lovely Miss Gideon who comes down regularly to volunteer. Things like mental health resources are so scarce in Haiti, so difficult to find. But as I say that, I have one 8-year-old girl who's been severely abused and having trouble in school, and one teenage boy who's just lost his mother and has started to react differently, who are both being seen free of charge by a local psychologist. And that is through our partnership with local social services that they've connected us with that psychologist. So the community and locals actually have been really supportive. We even have a local teacher who volunteers his time to tutor some of our girls, you know, in after school. So we do have 2 of our local employees are social workers who went to university in Port-au-Prince. They are definitely scarce, especially with things like social work and mental health. It's very difficult to find, but they're there. Yeah.
Bill?
Yeah, I have a friend, very close friend of mine from Cuba, and he spent 5 years over, probably the same time you did over there. And
Wow.
he explained to me a lot of things that happened, and I could really understand, you know, big insight. He had trouble with that language, the Creole language.
For real.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because when I come back to Canada now, a lot of my friends say that I have a French accent, and I actually speak Creole more than English these days, and so I start to think in Creole, but I think I learned it quite easily because, first of all, I was totally immersed in it. You know, there was no one else to speak English with, so I learned it quite quickly that way. Also being around children, you know, they tend to use gestures a lot, but I also had studied French in school, so that helped a lot because they are very similar.
Any more? Yeah.
The charities that were supporting these bad orphanages, are they contributing to your
Some of them are, actually. I did try and make a point of contacting those organizations when I could, not in the orphanage, but after they left. And some of them have supported, you know, so there are kids that they were used to seeing in the orphanage, and now they'll even come. And when they come, our outreach workers will take them to visit the different families of these kids, which is really exciting. And so some of them are supportive. Others just almost wanted to continue to be oblivious, I guess. And I guess a lot of people view it as easier to just help these kids who are, you know, in a group in an orphanage than support them with their families. But I try to also offer that, you know, that my staff are available if there have been other orphanages that have been closed down, and you know, we've supported other organizations by doing the visits to those kids' families.
Nick?
Morgan, I understand you got one country but several cases,
Mm-hmm.
but there are hundreds of countries with thousands of cases. How can you handle all of them?
This is a very good question, and it is always in the back of my mind, and I actually